Alright, so I'm doing an installation and a little bit of a video review of the Body Armor 4x4 Revo step sliders. Step sliders meaning that they are a 0-degree angle. They stick straight up off the side of the frame rails, and they have these little tread plates so they can be used as a step rail to get into a vehicle as well. So just looking at an overview of them, they're not symmetrical. The rear edge has this long gusseting tube on the side, and it is curved over there. The front edge near the front tires have a little bit more of an angular. I assume that's to help guide it off of rocks. So if you're driving forward and hit a rock, it'll kind of scooch you to the side. These are very substantial sliders. These are definitely pretty thick gauge steel. I'm not going to bother taking measurements or anything, but big welded gussets. And you can kind of see how they attach. Like I said, the angular side is near the front tire. So you've got the single post that sticks out here, and just going up underneath there you can see they bolt in through the side of the frame rail, but there's also that angled plate that goes underneath the cross member. So that is the cross member that goes kind of underneath the transfer case. There's the two other posts, and of course the gusseted tube on the rear, and this is a longer mounting bracket. And you can see here there are some strategic cutouts. So there's some protrusions off of the frame rails, so they're cut out so you don't smash them. And they've got different bolted hardware. There's some bolts that go underneath from the bottom up, but there are a couple of bolts that go from the side into the frame rail. And there's also a little bit of a hidden bolt that can be difficult to put a wrench on it, but that is right behind the gusset tube on the rear. So I think a lot of times it can be easier to understand how to install something once you kind of see the contextual information after it's already been installed. So this is the side I've already installed, and then we'll go ahead and start on the driver's side, which is actually supposed to be a little bit more difficult. So I'll pull my truck into the garage and get started. So I'm just going to lay the slider on the ground relatively lined up to where it's going to go, but you got some pre-work to do. Underneath the driver's side door right here, there's a wire harness. You're going to have to remove the clip here. You can use some type of screwdriver if you will, but a nice panel clip tool makes things a little bit easier. There you go, get underneath the clip. Now you got some slack because that main bracket is going to bolt up over here. And you also got some plastic plugs that are plugging up holes in the frame rail. Slider is going to bolt into that, so you need to get up underneath it, pull these plastic clips out. This is near the rear of the front doors. Underneath the frame rail there is a vertical bolt right here. This is a vertical bolt that goes to this cross member that goes over the drive shaft. So you're going to have to remove this bolt. I want to say it's a 14 millimeter. And it is. We will reuse this bolt, so I'm going to set this aside and not lose it. This is near the rear of the front tires. I'm going to go underneath the door, and I'm going to go on the back side of the frame rail over here and just slide underneath the vehicle some more. So here there is a plastic cover that will need to be removed, but there's also some bolts that hold on these brake lines. So I'm going to need to kind of flex these brake lines out of the way to be able to get some the backer nut bracket back here. So I think this looks like maybe a 12 millimeter socket, but I will confirm. But it's just moving this bolt and that bolt, so that way you have a little bit of play. You can unclip the lines here if need be. You don't need to relocate them or anything, but you're just going to have to get your hand back here. It's going to be difficult though. So this is a 12 millimeter socket that holds these brake lines on. I'll have to double check the size on the bolt back here, but that just holds this plastic cover on. I'm going to try not to bash my knuckles here. Alright, so that allows me to flex this a little bit, and these are hard lines, so they're not exactly flexible. I'm going to try and get the socket on this bolt up here, and this is just for this plastic cover. So you can see there's a little plastic cover here. I'm going to try and snake it out. We're going to need this gap to be able to fish hardware inside the enclosed box frame there. So this is kind of the pre-work that you got to do. This is Editor Rob here with a quick tip on another piece of pre-work we should go ahead and do now, and that is to take one of the single nut welded plates and go ahead and put that inside that front cross member where that front mount is going to bolt up on the slider. I actually did this out of sequence by accident, and the problem is once I already started a few of the bolts on the different mounts, it blocked access to be able to slip that nut plate into place inside that cross member. So go ahead and do that now. Now this is the hard part with the rock sliders since they're heavy. You can balance this one pretty well on two jack stands on either end, but you're gonna want something to help lift it into place in a controlled way so that you can get it where you need it to fasten hardware. So I've got some pretty tall jack stands on the front and back, and then I've got, this is just a scissor lift, and I ended up welding a little metal platform on top. You could get by with a hydraulic jack and some 2x4s to help support it, something like that. The rock slider itself isn't terribly heavy, like you can lift it by hand, but it's going to be probably impossible to lift it, hold it, and put hardware in. So being able to have it not fall on your face is nice. So you can see I got the jack stand underneath the main tube. I've got the larger jack underneath kind of the midsection, balancing the bracket here and also the main tube. And also got the jack stand balance on the main tube here. And I'm trying to get the height just right so that it lines up with the frame rail pretty well. And that looks like it's in pretty good shape, so I'm going to slide everything forward together, just very carefully. So I've got this slider in place. You can see it's flush up against the frame rail, but it's a little low. And so now that I got it supported on these jack stands and the jack in the middle, I can help lift this up in the middle, and then I can start raising the jack like one notch on the jack stands. So the first bolt that I'm going to go with is going to be that vertical bolt that I took out where the cross member is. So I'm just going to get that finger tight for now, but that should at least align most everything. But you want to kind of get everything finger tight to get all the hardware in before you start tightening things down. So I've got that one vertical bolt in. The next one is going to be the two ones in the side of the frame rail near the front tire. This one's going to be hard, but this is where you pop those plastic caps out. And there's the hole in the frame. Now, that's also where those brake lines were, and you have to have hardware on the backside. So they give you this welded nut bracket. So this is a welded piece of steel, and it's got a nut welded on the backside of it, and it's got a long handle on it. So where you removed that black plastic cover, you need to snake one arm back into the frame rail, and then you need to line up the bolt from the outside of the frame rail and the outside of the slider and try and catch the nut. It's a blind assembly. It's going to be tough. The bolts that they include will also have a flat washer and a split lock washer. So the best tip that I can give you is to hold the bracket outside the frame rail so you can kind of gauge how far you need to stick it inside the frame rail. You can kind of see where the end of the handle is for me. It roughly lines up with kind of this seam where it's welded on the bottom of the frame rail. What I did is I had my left hand coming up through this cavity right here, and I actually found it easier to kind of like snake my entire hand back there and get my actual finger on the welded nut. And then I had my right hand and a blind assembly on the back side. Make sure that you're spinning the bolt the right way. Now I still got the one on the end, but at least now that I got one piece of hardware in, I know I can just rotate it up and down with the handle until I can catch it, and I can actually line it up like with a screwdriver and get it lined up first. So that's what I'm going to do now. It can still be difficult to line up the bolt, make sure it's going in evenly, but you should be able to thread it in by hand if you got it in the right spot. Now I'm going to work on the third front bolt, which actually goes up vertically into another cross member. Let me show you underneath the vehicle. You can see on the front mount of the slider, You know, I got the two that go into the side of the frame rail, but then there's this bent flange, and that goes over here. It's a big long slot, and we're gonna bolt it to this cross member right here. It's gonna be similar bolt like all the others and a welded nut plate. So this bolt was actually pretty easy. Once you get the nut plate in here, I was able to snake a finger through the hole up here and kind of line up the nut plate and hold it in place and then just thread it in. So there's a little bit of a contortionist act to get your finger into that little hole in the frame rail. If it does slide all the way in and you can't capture it, you can poke a screwdriver in at the slot where this bolted joint is, right above the exhaust system. But this one's pretty easy to get, so go ahead and just hand tighten it so you can still shift it around to line up the other holes. So if you look on the back side of the frame rail, this is right kind of underneath the rear of the cab. You can kind of see the fuel tank right here. That's a good gauging point, but man, yeah, these brake lines are definitely in the way. So you can see how the bolt would come through right here. You want to put the welded nut plate laterally like that. It'll actually allow it to sit more flush to the frame rail, and it'll be further away from your brake lines. And so you don't want the length of that plate to be up and down, and it actually sits nearly perfectly in that the nut and the bolt don't really seem to be touching the brake lines, but definitely something I'll keep an eye on. There is another bolt that goes right behind where this gusset is on the rear, and the fuel tank is kind of blocking access, but I'm going to shine a light back here in the frame rail. And I think you'll be able to see there's a little rubber grommet, and that's where a bolt's going to pop through. One more thing that I'll add is that the bolt that's kind of blocked by this gusseting tube, you really have to use kind of a flat wrench like this and kind of manually tighten this hardware down. So for this last one, it's kind of in the middle. It's at the end of the long flange here, but there is a stud sticking out with a 12mm nut on it. There's also one on the other side of that gusset right here. I'm going to go ahead and take those out because that'll allow me to move the control box that's on the back side and get this last piece of hardware that goes into this oval slot right here. So on the back side of that frame rail, you can see this little control box, and I can actually remove that now, and you can see where that hardware is supposed to go. Again, you got brake lines, it's annoying, but I'll thread the bolt through there and the welded nut. Let me see if there's even a good spot to put it. Maybe vertically like that. You're gonna have your brake lines resting on it, but it's not really riding on a sharp edge, so we'll see how that fits. And it looks like those threaded studs are on a standoff there, so you should have enough room with the back side of this control module to fit that last piece of hardware. So I use a 21mm backer wrench on this welded nut plate in the frame rail, and then just a 21mm short well socket to tighten it on the bolt head on the outside, and that just helps prevent the plate from spinning around. I like it in the vertical orientation. And now the problem that you run into is putting this box back. Simply put, the bolt and welded nut plate protrude too far off of the frame rail, and so when you bolt this back into place, it does not sit flush. You could put a washer stack or some type of spacer in between the frame rail and the stud if you really wanted to, but I'm just going to take that piece of hardware off of the slider and just do without. So going underneath the frame rail at the midpoint of the vehicle, you get this bolted joint. This is the tab. So this bolt is going vertical, and that's where the tab is on the slider. And on this one, I put the spacer with the more flat hook, and it just kind of overhooks and kind of overhangs the inside of the frame rail. That gives it some bracing, so if a vertical impact on a rock hangs out on the slider, that's kind of creates a lot of torque at this joint. This will help hold it flat. The other one is the S-shaped bracket. That one does not have the spacer there. And I had one piece of hardware left over because that brake module, I didn't feel like I wanted to touch it. Didn't want to mess with it. You got to weigh the risk of relocating a bunch of stuff or undoing stuff, having large hardware poking up behind something, versus the risk of actually damaging your vehicle because your rock slider wasn't strong enough. So the last few things to double check. Wire harness on this front mount. Make sure that you don't pinch it and that it's going above there. You can see how I kind of notched out the plastic a little bit to make room for that welded nut bar handle to kind of stick out, so that way I could reinstall it. That just keeps mud from getting up inside the frame rail there. For the mount right here, I did go ahead and put some wire loom and zip ties on the brake lines just to give them a little bit of extra protection in case they rub on the hardware. They didn't seem like they were making a lot of contact, definitely not high pressure, but you know, with vibration and everything, you want to give it a little extra protection. But I did kind of unhook that white clip from the frame rail right here to make room. Everything else is essentially just tighten all this hardware down and you should be good.